Speaking of laws that seem bizarre, immediately before a handful of conversations about tithing, you see the line, "You shall not boil a baby goat, a kid, in its mother's milk." And I don't know, it's just a strange line, first of all, but then I don't know why it's connected to this conversation on tithing over and over and over. I didn't have time to sort it out. I just thought I'd give another example of bizarre laws this morning. Last week I was gone, and the reason was I was at a wedding of friends of ours, and one of the friends is a friend from the Hawkeye Marching Band. And I was officiating at this wedding, and this friend, Greg, is the most relational person that Sarah and I know. He's friends with everybody, and then he's ferocious about maintaining his relationships. So he remembers every birthday, and he calls you, and he drops in to visit, and he does this not just with you, but with all of his friends. So his wedding was this huge marching band reunion, which was really fun. But it was also nerve-wracking for me as the person whose job it was to talk about God before the Hawkeye Marching Band. Because the Hawkeye Marching Band is not known to be a particularly pious group. We're known for the same sorts of inappropriate shenanigans that the Badger Marching Band has become famous for of late. I had a friend ask me after the service, "So were you afraid we were going to be struck by lightning during the ceremony?" I said, "No." But I did have the sense that for many of those gathered, that any conversation about God would lead to, "Oh, please." That there would be major doubts that this conversation would have anything helpful to say or be at all meaningful for them or for their lives. So it was a bit awkward. But it was important for the couple and important for me to place the gift of love into sacred context, into the context of ultimate significance or God. And so I plowed ahead. I realized this week that experience prepared me for this Sunday, where I'll be talking about giving and tithing. It's unusual that we go into a conversation about giving and feel like it will be meaningful for our lives, and certainly not tithing, that it might be helpful in any way. If you're like me, when you think about giving, you think first about how much less you will have because of the gift, and not what might be created by the giving, or what we might receive through the process of giving. But this is an important practice for the church, and it's important for our own spiritual lives to reclaim generosity and to even reclaim the practice of the tithe itself. It's good for the church, it's good for God's world, and it's good for us. And we need to talk openly about this. The passage from Deuteronomy that was read is a surprising passage, I think. I was surprised by it as I spent some time with it. Moses, it's the second book of laws, as Katie said, and Moses starts speaking in chapter 5 and giving out command after command after command and law after law to the people of Israel. And he's still speaking in chapter 14. And then we have this verse, "Set apart a tithe of all of the yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field," Moses says. So after harvest, you have this huge mound of grain in your field. You take a chunk, 10%, and you set it aside. You still have a really big mound, but you have a pretty big portion over here too. And then we have this really fascinating line. The next sentence says, "In the presence of the Lord your God, in the place that God will choose as a dwelling for God's name, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil, as well as the firstlings of your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God." Now, somewhere when I was growing up, someone taught me that giving in ancient Israel went something like this. You brought in your grain, you brought in your first fruits, you brought in your lamb, whatever, to the priest, and the priest burned it all. The fire consumed it all until there was only smoke that went up to the heavens, and God smelled it. Lamb and barley. Smells good. I'll be nice to that one. That was the image I had in my head, and that was such a waste of good food. But this picture of giving makes so much more sense, and it's so much more appealing. The people are to bring in 10% of their harvest to wherever they've decided that the holy place is, where God's name is. And then they eat it. They share a meal. And everybody's bringing in their 10%. And they're all eating together. It's a party. And the party goes on for days because they've got a lot of food. It's a Thanksgiving feast together. And it's supposed to be festive. The next line says that if you live a long ways away and you can't bring in all your bushel baskets, you can't lead your fatted calves all the way in, that's fine. Just cash them out for money and bring the money to the holy place. And then buy whatever it is you want. Whatever you want. If you want oxen, buy the big fellas. If you want some sheep, buy the woolly critters. If you want some wine, grab some wineskins. If you want some strong drink, stronger than wine. Learn about this in the marching band. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's a party. It's supposed to be fun. If it gets wild, it's okay. Enjoy life. That's the purpose of the tithe. Now, there's one condition. The condition is that God wants the Thanksgiving feast held in God's presence. And it's not so that God can keep an eye on this wild party. It's because feasting in God's presence nurtures gratitude. God's presence reminds people that they are dependent upon God for the abundance they've received. That in their producing, in all of their hard work throughout the year, they have also received. They've received the gift of the sun. They've received God's gift of the rain. They've received God's gift of the soil. They've received the miracle of the seed that springs to life mysteriously and grows into a plant that bears fruit. They've received so much. And remembering this makes life better. The people are all participants in God's miracle of life. They've been given so much, and giving a small portion of that back nurtures their awareness of God's generosity, and that makes life better. Then God uses everybody's 10% to serve the people some more. God serves them with party, with festivity. God serves them by providing for the priestly class, which helps them stay focused on God's way of life. And God provides for the most vulnerable in the midst of the community: the widow, the alien, the orphan. Now, in this story, the tithe isn't a burdensome obligation. It's an opportunity, both to nurture gratitude, which makes life better, and to help provide for all of the needs of the community, both joy and festivity and basic needs, which makes life better. Now, that seems to me a good description of what God does through the church as well. God takes our generosity as we give to the ministries of the church, and through them God nurtures our gratitude. We realize that through our work, through our producing, we're also receiving. We are dependent upon God's generosity first, and this nurtures our gratitude, which over time makes life better. And God also nurtures our relationships that are here. The church should be like a party, and the relationships that are formed in this church should lead to other parties. And as we strengthen the ministries of the church, we strengthen the community that's here. And God also takes our generosity and provides for the most vulnerable in our midst as well. God does so much with our generosity. Now, I've mentioned in years past that tithing is an important practice for Sarah and me, that this practice has deepened our gratitude over time, and it has deepened our commitment to the church and God's purposes in the world. I invite you this week, as you consider your giving for this next year, to think about your giving in terms of percentage of your income. And if you want to think about your whole charitable giving, rather than just your giving to the church, that's fine too. But maybe this is the year that you're called to increase that giving a percentage of your income, either to the church or to all of the charities that you support. Now, as with so many practices, we think that our giving is only about our act, our gift. But we find through the practice that it's about so much more, that we receive so much more than we give through the process. I want to share a story that I think illustrates how working toward a tithe benefits the spiritual life. It comes from the book 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations by Robert Schnase, which is, I think it's just a great last name. But it's a good story. It's a good story, too. Matt and Carrie grew up in faithful United Methodist families. They're in their mid-30s with 2 young children. They're both professionals with moderately high incomes, even though Carrie works part-time while the children are young. They live in a familiar suburban lifestyle, paying for a home mortgage. They have 2 car payments. They have preschool bills, etc. Matt and Carrie decided to enter into the Disciple Bible Study, which is a Methodist Bible study curriculum, to learn more about the faith. And they did. And that process encouraged them to become more involved in the life of the church. And they did. They started a Sunday school class for other people their age. They became involved in youth ministries and children's ministries and outreach ministries. And they found that all of their relationships, their main relationships, were from that church. They loved their church. Well, 5 years ago, as the church prepared for Stewardship Month, the pastor invited Matt and Carrie to write a devotional about giving for the newsletter. And this opportunity caused them to think about their own giving. And the stewardship program that year focused on proportional giving and working towards the goal of the tithe. And so they did the math for the first time. And they realized they were giving just under 2% of their income to support the ministries of the church. And so they started wondering about tithing and wanting to look into it a little bit more. And they started to. Even though they began to prayerfully study the biblical roots of the tithe and all that supports this practice, giving 10% simply seemed like way too much. They had a mortgage, they had car payments, they had retirement savings to think about, they had college savings to think about. They never had that much money left over, so how could they do this? Well, they prepared their giving statement for the newsletter, and they prepared it based on Jesus' story of the widow who gives everything out of poverty. And through that, they challenged the congregation to consider increasing their gift. And they said, we are pledging to increase our gift by a percentage of our income, which means we're basically doubling our gift to the church this year. Well, the course of the year went by, and they made it just fine. It was okay. The next year, they decided to increase their giving a percentage again to 4%. But now they had some things to think about. That involved rethinking some spending habits. They looked at some of their spending patterns, such as how frequently they bought fast food instead of eating at home as a family. They thought about how often how long they drive their cars, how long it is before they replace them. They thought about their entertainment choices as a family. This level of giving caused them to look at other financial matters too, like their savings and their investing. And they made subtle positive changes in their lifestyle because of it. Well, over the course of a few more years, Matt and Carrie stayed on this course, and they ended up moving to the full practice of tithing. And it seemed like a crazy and extravagant journey for them. But they knew this practice had also changed their lives. They felt like the tithe had deepened their understanding of faith, and it had placed God more towards the center of their life. This giving took trust. It took faith. And they could tell a difference in their lives because of it. Tithing also forced them to think about the use of money and how all they had received had been entrusted to them by God. Tithing caused them to spend more wisely, save more diligently, and consider the impact their investments had on society. Now, for the first time, they started thinking that each dollar they had a mission. The many conversations they had about spending priorities, family spending habits, saving patterns, the handling of debt, had enriched their relationship. Commitment to the tithe forced significant discussions about their goals and values as a family that they knew they wouldn't have had otherwise. And finally, they had become more keenly involved and invested in the life of the church, even though they were extremely involved before. They delighted in the church's growth, the effectiveness of its ministries, the outreach and mission. They felt like they truly belonged, that their place was solidified in this community because of their giving. They made the church's mission their own and prayed for the people and its ministries with more passion than they had before. I found that to be a helpful story for me, and I know it's a story that rings true in my own life in many ways. I want to thank you for your giving, for the ways that you support the ministry of this church. And I encourage you to prayerfully think about your giving this next year as well. Our giving to the church is good for the ministry of the church, it's good for God's world, and it's good for us as practicing Christians. We thank God for God's many gifts to us, and we ask for God's blessings as well as we continue to walk this way of generosity and this way of life. Amen.